whispers of forgotten empires, echoes of lost gods, and truths buried in time. Welcome to Ancient Luminaries, where the ancient world comes alive.
Most people meet J.R.R. Tolkien through a map, a name written in careful letters, rivers like silver threads, mountains like the spines of sleeping beasts. Then, sooner or later, that map starts to feel less like invention and more like memory, like someone is drawing a world he has already walked through, not one he is creating from nothing. That feeling is not an accident. Tolkien did not build Middle-earth out of cold ideas. He built it out of longings, losses, loyalties, and a very specific kind of love for place. If you understand the first 13 years of his life, you begin to understand why his fictional world has such tenderness for home, such patience with trees, and such suspicion of any power that tries to dominate. If you enjoy biographies told like living stories, where inner life matters, as much as the dates, subscribe and stay with us. We keep following the people behind the books, the songs, and the movements, because the work always makes more sense when you understand the human being who carried it. Tolkien's story begins far from the green English hills people associate with hobbits. On January 3rd, 1892, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was born in Bloemfontein, in what was then the Orange Free State in southern Africa. His parents, Arthur and Mabel, were English. Arthur worked as a bank manager, and the family had moved to Africa for his career. Ronald's earliest cradle was not a quiet cottage with an apple tree out front. It was a distant place where sun and dust and sickness could reshape a family's fate. Tolkien later said his memories of Africa were slight but vivid. Even that phrase tells you something. Slight, because he was small. Vivid, because early impressions can burn like photographs. He did not remember a full life there. He remembered fragments, a light, a heat, a sense of distance, a feeling that the world was bigger than any one village. There is a famous childhood anecdote that people love to repeat. It says Tolkien was bitten by a large baboon spider in the garden, and that a caretaker panicked and sucked out the poison, perhaps saving him from serious harm. Some readers hear that and immediately point to Shelob, the giant spider in The Lord of the Rings, as if a single bite created a single monster. Tolkien himself pushed back against that kind of neat psychological story. He disliked spiders, yes, but he did not claim the bite explained anything. Real lives are rarely that tidy. Still, the deeper point remains. Tolkien had a mind that could give fear a shape. Later, his fiction would be full of creatures that embody a particular kind of evil that traps, consumes, and controls. A web is domination without visible chains. It waits quietly. It does not negotiate. It catches you. Even if the spider bite did not directly produce a spider villain, Tolkien's imagination clearly knew how to turn primal discomfort into myth. The first great change in his life arrived quickly. When Tolkien was very young, his mother took him and his younger brother, Hilary, to England. This was meant to be a long visit, partly for health, partly for family connection, perhaps partly because Mabel wanted to be closer to a familiar world. Arthur stayed behind to finish business and planned to follow. He never did. In February 1896, Tolkien's father died in South Africa before he could rejoin his family. The reason is usually given as rheumatic fever. For the family, the reason mattered less than the result. A father who was supposed to arrive became a sealed grave thousands of miles away. Tolkien grew up with almost no memory of him. Later in life, he recalled only one small, almost cinematic fragment. The image of his father preparing luggage, painting Tolkien on a trunk as if marking it for travel. It is a painful detail because it suggests a life that was meant to move forward and instead stopped cold. From that point forward, Tolkien's early life becomes, above all, a story about his mother. Mabel returned to the Birmingham area with 2 small boys and a thin financial cushion. The promise of a career in a far-off colony did not translate into security for a widow in England. She had intelligence, discipline, and an uncommon stubborn courage, but she could not conjure stability out of thin air. She had to choose carefully where to live, how to educate her sons, and how to keep their inner world from collapsing. She did not only keep them alive, she built them. In the early years, she taught them at home. Ronald learned Latin while he was still very young. He did not treat language as a dry tool. Even as a boy, he could feel that words carry history inside them. He could sense that language is not merely communication. It is inheritance. It is rhythm. It is identity. Mabel also taught him botany, not as a dull catalog of plant names, but as an education in attention. She trained him to notice shape, texture, smell, and the way a plant seems to stand in the world. That habit of attention became one of the deep powers of his writing. When Tolkien later describes a tree, it rarely feels like a stage prop. It feels like a living presence with its own dignity. If you want to see how this motherly education echoed through his fiction, look at how Tolkien treats ordinary landscapes. He does not describe nature as scenery, he describes it as home. A hill has a mood, a lane has a smell, a river has a voice. Even silence in his world feels textured. You can't teach that by telling someone to be descriptive. You teach it by teaching someone to look, slowly, lovingly, and repeatedly. Then Mabel made a decision that changed the social air around the family. She converted to Catholicism. To modern ears, that can sound like a private preference. In early 20th century England, it could be a rupture. The Church of England was the social default for many families, and Catholicism still carried old suspicions. For Mabel, conversion seems to have meant conflict with relatives and a reduction in support from family members who disapproved. Tolkien would later speak as if his mother suffered for this choice, and he carried that memory into adulthood. His Catholic identity was not, for him, the kind of thing you could swap like a coat. Mabel's conversion also shaped Ronald's imagination in a quieter way. It taught him that belief is not only what you think, it is what you are willing to lose. When a child watches an adult endure rejection, the child learns a sharp lesson. The world is not always fair. Goodness does not always get rewarded. Standing by your convictions can cost you comfort. Tolkien carried that lesson into his stories, but he translated it into myth rather than memoir. His heroes are rarely winners in the modern sense. They endure. They hold faith when the outcome is uncertain. They keep promises even when promises become heavy. They do not measure their worth by applause. That is not accidental. It is the emotional echo of his home. This matters because later readers sometimes argue about Tolkien's faith as if it were a political badge. For Tolkien, it was family, it was grief, it was gratitude. It was also a quiet form of martyrdom in his imagination, not in the dramatic sense of public execution, but in the slow sense. Being misunderstood, being cut off, doing the right thing anyway, and paying for it with loneliness. While those spiritual and social tensions played out, Mabel still understood something practical. Children need a world they can explore. For a few years, she gave Tolkien a place that became one of the most fertile landscapes in his memory, Sarehole. Sarehole was then a village-like area outside Birmingham. It was not a tourist postcard. It was mills, lanes, hedgerows, fields, and the kind of countryside where boys could roam and feel that the world belonged to them. Near it was Sarehole Mill. Nearby, too, was Moseley Bog, a stretch of wet woodland that could feel ancient and mysterious. These places mattered because they gave Tolkien two feelings at once. The first feeling was security, a small world you can learn by heart. The second feeling was wonder, a small world that still contains mystery. That combination is the emotional blueprint of the Shire. For Tolkien, that early countryside was not just pretty, it was structured in a way a child's mind can memorize. A lane curves and disappears behind a hedge. A footbridge crosses a small stream. A mill wheel turns with a steady rhythm. A patch of woods becomes a private kingdom. Years later, when Tolkien wrote about hobbits, he gave them the kind of comforts that sound almost mundane. Well-kept gardens, pantry shelves, familiar neighbors, predictable meals. Those comforts can feel like decoration until you remember how many children never get them for long. In Tolkien's case, the Shire comforts are not sentimental fluff. They are the language of gratitude. This is why he rarely mocks simple life. He treats it as something that deserves reverence. He also learned, in Sarehole, that the ordinary world can contain menace without turning into melodrama. A farmer can be frightening when you have stolen his mushrooms. A dark patch of trees can feel like a boundary you shouldn't cross. A sudden storm can make you feel very small. A deep pool can look like a mouth. Tolkien's later forests are full of that exact childhood feeling. Not horror movie terror, but the quiet awareness that nature has its own power and that your safety is not guaranteed. People sometimes imagine Tolkien invented the Shire as a simple fantasy of rural life. In truth, the Shire is a memory of childhood innocence, made more precious because innocence did not last. In Sarehole, Tolkien and his brother played near the mill and in the woods. They invented characters for the people around them. Some of the mill workers, in their imagination, became ogres, one black-bearded, one white-bearded figures that were not literally monsters but felt monstrous to boys who wanted the world to be a story. This is how childhood imagination works. You take ordinary adults and you turn them into myth. There were also small acts of mischief. One often retold story says the boys stole mushrooms from a farmer and were chased away. Decades later, Tolkien wrote a scene where hobbits are caught stealing mushrooms. He did not need to copy his childhood to write it. He simply knew that feeling, the mix of guilt and laughter, the pounding heart, the sense that a simple theft could become an adventure. Even more than mischief, Tolkien absorbed the character of the landscape. He learned what it feels like when trees bend over a path and create a tunnel of shadow. He learned the smell of wet earth. He learned how a stream can sound like conversation. He learned that a small patch of countryside can feel like an entire universe, especially to a child whose life in the city feels cramped. Those are not facts you store in a notebook. They become part of your nervous system. This is also why Tolkien later loved trees with unusual intensity. He loved them not only because they were beautiful, but because they represented rootedness. A tree is anchored. It does not chase fashion. It does not hurry, yet it is alive. It sways, it responds, it grows slowly, patiently, stubbornly. For Tolkien, trees became almost moral symbols, the opposite of frantic modern domination. Later in life, he would be irritated by noise and speed. He disliked the way machines could flatten the texture of ordinary life. People sometimes try to turn him into a political mascot, as if he were secretly writing propaganda about the modern world. Tolkien resisted that. His love of nature was not a party program. It was memory. It was affection. It was also, for him, theology creation as craftsmanship. Creation as something you are meant to respect rather than exploit. Still, Sarehole did not remain forever. Childhood places rarely do. By the early 1900s, the family moved into more urban settings. Ronald began to enter formal education beyond his mother's lessons. His intelligence was obvious. He had a gift for language and an almost musical sensitivity to sound. He won opportunities that a poor widow could not have purchased. He attended St. Philip's School for a time, and then, through scholarship, entered King Edward's School in Birmingham, one of the most prestigious schools in the area. This was a turning point. School did not only teach him, it gave him a ladder. It also placed him among students who could become rivals, companions, and, eventually, friends. Yet those school years were still lived under the shadow of instability. Money was always a concern. Pride could not be careless. A scholarship is not only an honor, it is pressure. It is the knowledge that you do not get to fail casually. You have been given a chance that must be protected. The shift from countryside freedom to city discipline was not gentle. Birmingham at the turn of the century was not a romantic place. It was smoke, brick, crowded streets, and the sense that the modern world was speeding up. For a boy who loved lanes and trees, the city could feel like compression. That contrast, green world versus mechanical world, became one of the emotional engines of his later fiction. The Shire is not only a nice place, it is a protest against a world that forgets how to breathe. At King Edward's School, Tolkien was surrounded by boys who were also talented and by teachers who expected excellence. He did well, but he was not simply a natural genius floating above effort. He worked, he read. He learned how to concentrate for long stretches, the kind of concentration that later makes it possible to write a 1,000-page myth without giving up. His love of language also expanded beyond the classroom. He began to notice that languages have personalities. Latin felt firm and architectural. Greek felt quick and bright. Some older Germanic words felt heavy, like stones. Some Celtic sounds felt like wind. He did not always have the vocabulary to describe these sensations yet, but he could feel them. He began to play with sounds, shaping them into invented words. Those inventions were not yet Middle-earth. They were the first sparks, a teenage mind discovering that language can be made, not merely inherited. The important point is this. Before Tolkien became famous for stories, he was already practicing the art that made his stories possible: listening. Then, in 1904, the second great rupture arrived. Mabel Tolkien became seriously ill with diabetes. At that time, diabetes was often fatal. The treatments that would later save countless lives did not exist. Mabel's illness progressed quickly. In November 1904, she died, and Ronald was only 12. For the second time, Tolkien lost a parent. This is the core wound of his early life. He was not simply grieving. He was orphaned in a world where money was already thin and family support had been strained by religious conflict. Without help, the boys could have been scattered into instability. Help came through a priest. Father Francis Xavier Morgan of the Birmingham Oratory became their guardian. Tolkien later referred to him as a second father. He remembered him with complicated tenderness, practical, sometimes strict, yet ultimately devoted to the boys' welfare. This guardianship was not symbolic. It was a lifeline. It offered structure, housing arrangements, and crucially, protection for Tolkien's education. Father Morgan also had something Tolkien lacked: books. The oratory had a library, and Morgan had his own collection. For a boy whose life had been narrowed by loss, a library is not just entertainment, it is escape, education, and possibility. Tolkien read widely, he absorbed stories and myths. He tasted older worlds through older words. He also encountered a flavor of Spanish life through Morgan's background and connections, a small reminder that England was not the whole map of human culture. This matters because Tolkien's imagination was never purely local. The Shire may feel like England, but Middle-earth is not a simple English postcard. It is a blending of northern myth, Christian moral vision, and the deep music of languages that come from many places. The Guardian's strictness also had a purpose. Morgan was trying to keep Tolkien's ladder steady. A scholarship could be lost. A distracted student could slip. A boy without parents could fall into a life that offered no time for study. So Morgan pushed him toward discipline, sometimes with a stern hand. Tolkien later remembered that sternness with a kind of grown-up understanding. He did not describe Morgan as perfect. He described him as faithful. It also meant Tolkien grew up inside a kind of disciplined Catholic environment that was not merely doctrinal. It was communal. It was lived. It had rituals and routines that could hold a person together when emotions were raw. Even so, life did not become instantly easy. The brothers lived in different places under Morgan's care. Sometimes they stayed with relatives. Sometimes they boarded. Sometimes they moved and moved again. From the outside, these moves can look like minor logistical details. From a child's perspective, each move is a small exile. New house, new rules, new neighborhood, new loneliness. This is where Tolkien's personality began to harden into its adult shape. He was not naturally a loud, socially effortless figure. Losing parents young can push a person inward. Tolkien tended to form deep, intense friendships rather than wide, casual networks. Loyalty mattered to him. A small circle mattered more than a crowd. That pattern later became part of his fiction. His stories do not glorify crowds. They glorify fellowship, small bands held together by trust. Friendship in Tolkien is not entertainment. It is courage shared. During these teenage years, Tolkien's gifts sharpened even further. He studied Latin and Greek seriously. He also began to sense something that would guide his entire life. The idea that language is not simply learned, it is discovered. Words have roots, sounds have histories, meanings drift, pronunciations mutate. If you listen closely, you can hear the past inside the present. This fascination would become his academic calling. He would become a philologist, a scholar of language history. But in these early years, it was already alive. He took pleasure in the way a word feels in the mouth. He noticed how beauty can exist in sound alone, even before meaning is fully understood. This is where many people misunderstand Tolkien's creative process. They assume he invented stories first and then added language as decoration. Often, for Tolkien, it went the other way. A sound suggested a word suggested a people demanded a history demanded a world. Language for him was not a costume. It was the skeleton underneath the story. It also meant that school was not only preparation for exams, it was a laboratory for invention. Tolkien began experimenting with created languages when he was young. Even when those early inventions were rough, they reveal the instinct. He wanted to build meaning out of sound. Yet adolescence is not only intellect. It is also longing. It is also loneliness. It is also love. In 1908, when Tolkien was 16, he and his brother were moved into a boarding house in Edgbaston on Duchess Road. Boarding life could feel restrictive, especially for young people who had already lost their family anchor. This house also became the setting for one of the most important meetings in Tolkien's personal story. It is there that Tolkien met Edith Bratt. Edith was 19 at the time, older than Tolkien. She was also an orphan. She was a talented pianist. She had her own grief and her own hunger for warmth. In a world that had offered both of them loss and restraint, the presence of someone who understood could feel like oxygen. Their friendship grew quickly. They talked. They joked. They went out for simple pleasures when they could. Edith introduced Tolkien to small tastes of ordinary fun, the kind of fun that is easy to dismiss until you have lived without it. Ronald, for his part, offered Edith something she needed too. Someone who listened and saw her as a person, not as a burden. There is another detail worth holding on to here. Edith was not only a romantic interest, she was an artist. Music was her language. She could sit at a piano and make a room feel larger than it really was. For Tolkien, who was already discovering that sound can build worlds, that mattered. He understood that art is not decoration, art is survival. Art is what keeps the soul from shrinking. In a small boarding house, with guardians watching and money always tight, art could feel like a doorway to breathing space. Their bond was not only about romance, it was about companionship in the middle of constraint. There is a temptation to narrate this like a soft romantic film. The truth is more tense. Their closeness developed under watchful eyes. Guardians monitored, time was rationed, expectations were strict. Tolkien's education was not negotiable. It was the fragile ladder out of poverty and instability. Father Morgan saw Edith as a danger to Tolkien's future. He did not only worry about distraction from schoolwork, he also worried about religion. Edith was Anglican, and Morgan feared that Tolkien's devotion and direction could be altered by an early attachment. He issued a strict instruction. Tolkien was not to see Edith or communicate with her until he turned 21. That order was brutal for a young man in love. Tolkien obeyed. What makes this moment so powerful is that it foreshadows the kind of moral drama Tolkien would later write so well. He understood temptation, not only as lust for pleasure, but as the temptation to choose an easier road. It would have been easy to defy Morgan and keep seeing Edith in secret. It would have been easy to turn the romance into rebellion. Tolkien chose a harder path, patience. Patience is not glamorous. It does not look heroic in a newspaper. It looks like silence, waiting, studying, and keeping your heart steady when you are not sure the future will reward you. That kind of patience is everywhere in Tolkien's later stories. The long road, the slow turning of seasons, the sense that victory, if it comes at all, comes through endurance. In other words, the boy who obeyed in a boarding house was training the man who would one day write about small people carrying heavy burdens without applause. Not because he was weak, but because he understood duty. He had been carried through orphanhood by guardianship. He had been given educational chances that could vanish if he failed. He also had a deep loyalty to the man who had taken responsibility for him. Obedience for Tolkien was not blind. It was chosen, and it was costly. For Edith, the separation was not a moral exercise. It was loneliness. Her own guardians arranged for her to move away to Cheltenham, placing real distance where there had once been daily conversation. The relationship was frozen in silence, with no guarantee it would survive. This moment matters because it shows Tolkien's temperament in miniature. He could love deeply, but he could also endure. He could feel intensely, but he could also hold to a promise even when it hurt. That combination, passion and endurance, would shape everything that came later, including his writing. It also left Tolkien on the edge of the next chapter of his life. He was no longer the child running through Sarehole fields. He was a young man with scholarship pressure, with a mind that heard language like music, with a heart that had tasted love and been commanded to let it go. His world was about to widen dramatically. He would form friendships at school that felt like the first fellowship of his life, a circle of bright young men who believed they were called to remake the world through art and words. He would go to Oxford. He would watch Europe fall into war. He would carry grief that never fully left him. He would also begin, in the middle of that darkness, to build the earliest foundations of the mythology that would become Middle-earth. That is where we go next. The world was about to widen dramatically, just as Tolkien felt his private world narrowing. The letter he had promised not to write, the voice he had been forced not to hear, the companionship he had been asked to postpone, those were locked behind silence while his days filled with lectures, examinations, and the steady pressure of proving he deserved the scholarship that kept his future alive. At King Edward's school, the loneliness that followed his mother's death began to change shape. He found a handful of boys who shared the same restless delight in words and ideas. They did not talk simply to pass time. They talked as if conversation could build a future. They formed a small society with a deliberately ridiculous name, partly to hide seriousness under humor, and partly because teenagers often protect what they love by pretending not to care. They called it the Tea Club and Barrovian Society, the TCBS, named after the places they met and the little rituals that made a school day feel less like a machine. It began with tea and jokes, then grew into something deeper, a pact that they would make art that mattered. They wrote poetry, critiqued each other's lines, argued about literary destiny, and imagined themselves as a generation with a mission. It is easy to smile at youthful confidence until you remember that war was coming, a war that would break those dreams like glass. The members of this circle became part of Tolkien's lifelong emotional vocabulary. There was Christopher Wiseman, steady and practical, who would survive and remain a friend. There was Rob Gilson, warm and visionary. There was Jeffrey Batch Smith, a poet with a fierce sensitivity. Tolkien loved them not because they flattered him, but because they sharpened him. They challenged his laziness, mocked his pretension, and demanded he take his gifts seriously. For someone who had learned that nothing is guaranteed, friendship was not a casual accessory. It was a chosen loyalty. In 1911, Tolkien won a scholarship to Exeter College, Oxford. He arrived with two kinds of pressure. One was external, the knowledge that he could not waste time, that poverty waited if he failed. The other was internal, the sense that he was meant to do something with language that ordinary careers could not contain. Oxford could be intimidating. It was full of old stone, old confidence, old customs, yet Tolkien's mind belonged there. He began studying classics, but the deeper currents of his attention kept pulling him toward the history of words, toward the way languages evolve, collide, and leave fossils behind in everyday speech. He switched to English language and literature, a field that let him do what he loved most: trace sound into meaning, meaning into culture, culture into story. At Oxford, he did not simply read literature, he listened to it. He heard how Anglo-Saxon carried weight and shadow. He heard how Norse sagas moved with a hard, clear rhythm. He heard how medieval romance carried sweetness and grief at the same time. He began to understand that a civilization's soul can be found in the kinds of stories it tells when it is not trying to impress anyone. This was also the period when his private invention became more serious. Tolkien had been playing with languages for years, but now he began shaping them with grammar, internal history, and aesthetic purpose. He was not making secret codes for fun. He was building languages the way a composer builds a symphony, with repeated motifs, rules, and a sense of inevitability. He later explained that his stories grew out of his languages. A sound suggested a word suggested a people demanded a history demanded a world. While Oxford opened his mind, the silence around Edith remained like a sealed room in his heart. Father Morgan's command had been strict: no contact until he turned 21. Tolkien obeyed, not because longing vanished, but because he understood how fragile his future was. Obedience became a kind of inner discipline, a slow training in patience. He learned to carry desire without feeding it daily. That habit could have made him colder. Instead, it made him steadier. On January 3rd, 1913, Tolkien turned 21. On that day, he did what he had waited years to do. He wrote to Edith. The letter was not cautious, it was not a test. It was a declaration. He told her he still loved her, and he asked her to marry him. The answer did not arrive as a simple fairy tale yes. Edith's life had moved forward in the years of silence. She had formed new ties, and she was engaged to another man. Tolkien's letter landed like a voice from the past, reopening a door she had tried to close. Yet her response also revealed the truth Tolkien had hoped for. She broke her engagement. They met again, and the reunion carried a weight their teenage friendship had not prepared them for. The years apart had not cooled love into something small. They had stored it like firewood. When they finally stood face to face, it was not two people picking up a casual thread. It was two orphans recognizing, again, that they had found something rare, someone who understood loss without turning it into bitterness. They became engaged, then another tension entered, quieter but powerful. Tolkien's Catholicism was not negotiable for him. It was tied to his mother's memory and to a sense of loyalty he treated almost like a sacred vow. Edith was not Catholic. Tolkien wanted a marriage that shared the center of life, not simply a house. He asked Edith to convert. Conversion is never only intellectual. It can shift identity, friendships, and family expectations. Edith hesitated. She was not an ornament in Tolkien's story. She had her own will, her own pain, her own pride. Yet over time, she did convert to Catholicism, and for Tolkien that sacrifice mattered. It was, in his mind, not merely agreement, but commitment. Love willing to carry cost. Father Morgan, once the barrier, became part of the reconciliation. Tolkien had obeyed him when obedience hurt, and that obedience mattered. It proved Tolkien's devotion was not impulsive. Over time, Morgan accepted the engagement, even if he never fully stopped worrying. In Tolkien's later memory, Morgan remained a man of strict love, controlling at times, yet fundamentally faithful. Their engagement did not mean life became calm, because history was about to shatter the atmosphere of Europe. By 1914, the old assumptions of educated life were collapsing. When the First World War erupted, young men who had been discussing poetry and future plans suddenly found themselves surrounded by recruitment posters, uniform parades, and the kind of patriotic pressure that turns hesitation into suspicion. The war did not feel like a distant event. It felt like a giant hand closing around an entire generation. Tolkien did not rush into combat out of romance for glory. He finished his degree first. He believed, stubbornly, that he should complete what he had begun. He also sensed that war might take everything, so whatever you could finish before the storm mattered. In 1915, he graduated with first-class honors. Soon afterward, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Lancashire Fusiliers. Training followed, the long, grinding transformation from scholar into officer. The war was no longer thunder beyond the horizon. It was inside his schedule, his body, his future. Before he left for the front, he married Edith. They married on March 22, 1916. It was not a lavish celebration. It was a vow made under the shadow of deployment. They were not naive about what might happen next. Tolkien had waited through years of enforced silence. He was not going to let war steal the chance to commit. Then he went to France. The Western Front was not the kind of battlefield that produces clean, heroic legends. It was mud, wire, shells, rats, disease, and the constant presence of death. It was the mechanization of killing, the transformation of human bodies into numbers and reports. Tolkien served as a signals officer, responsible for communication. That role placed him close enough to danger to feel it, and close enough to the machinery of command to see how impersonal war could become. In July 1916, the Battle of the Somme began. Even saying the name feels like tapping on a scar. The Somme was destruction on an industrial scale, a level of slaughter that made old language about honor and triumph feel thin. Tolkien entered that world not as a detached observer but as a participant, carrying fear, responsibility, and a sense that civilization itself was cracking. He did not leave the Somme with a single dramatic wound that could be turned into a neat, heroic tale. He left with trench fever, exhaustion, and a body that could no longer keep pace with the front. In late 1916, he became ill and was sent back to England. The illness likely saved his life. Many of his closest friends did not return. The TCBS began to vanish. Rob Gilson was killed early in the Somme. Jeffrey Bache Smith was mortally wounded later that year. Tolkien received the news like a series of blows to the chest. These were not distant acquaintances. They were the people who had shared his dreams and held him to his promise. They had believed they would change the world with words. Now they were gone, buried in mud and paperwork. Grief can crush creativity. It can also deepen it, because the mind refuses to let the dead vanish completely. Tolkien began to feel that one way to honor his fallen friends was to continue the work they had dreamed about, not as a memorial plaque, not as a tribute poem. As a living creation, he carried their voices in his mind and tried to build something worthy of the promise they had made to each other. This is where the earliest roots of his mythology began to take more coherent shape. During recovery and periods away from the front, Tolkien wrote fragments that would later be gathered as part of the earliest versions of his legendarium. He began to imagine a great history behind the visible world, a chain of ages, languages, and tragedies. He was not writing about trenches directly. He was writing about the spiritual atmosphere trenches create, the sense that evil can be organized, that beauty can be shattered, that courage often looks like endurance rather than conquest, and that survival does not automatically feel like victory. One memory became particularly luminous. During a time when they lived in Yorkshire, Tolkien watched Edith dance in a woodland clearing, her movement and laughter turning an ordinary patch of grass into something like enchantment. He carried the image for decades, and it became myth. In his imagination, it transformed into the story of Beren and Luthien, a mortal man drawn into a world of immortals by the beauty of a woman who dances beneath the trees. Tolkien did not reduce Edith to a character. He did something subtler and more intimate. He turned the feeling of that moment into legend, as if he were saying that love, even in a brutal century, can still look like light in the woods. By the time the war ended in 1918, Tolkien was 26. He returned to a society that had been emptied and altered. The world before the war felt gone. The new world felt uncertain, as if it could not decide whether to grieve or to celebrate. Tolkien carried the loss of his friends, the memory of mechanized violence, and a deepened suspicion toward anything that treats people as units. He also carried a sharpened calling. He wanted to preserve. He wanted to recover. He wanted to build a world where the beauty that war had tried to erase could still be spoken. After the war, he needed work. He had a family to support. Romantic dreams do not feed children. He worked for a time on the Oxford English Dictionary, tracing word histories and shaping definitions. The job fit him. It demanded patience, accuracy, and a respect for the weight of words. It also trained him further in a discipline that would later make his fiction feel solid: the refusal to treat language casually. From there, he moved into academic life, first at Leeds and then back to Oxford. In 1925, he became Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon. Now, the private obsession of a boy became the public vocation of a scholar. He taught Beowulf and Old English texts not as dead relics but as living presences. He could make a classroom feel as if an ancient voice had entered the room. His approach was never merely technical. He believed old literature carries a moral atmosphere. Beowulf, in his eyes, was heroic and haunted at the same time, full of courage yet honest about death. He resisted the modern habit of treating ancient poetry as a museum artifact. He treated it as something that still speaks because it was born from real fear, real loyalty, real human limits. In 1936, he delivered a lecture on Beowulf that helped change how scholars viewed the poem. He argued it should be treated as poetry, as an artistic work with mood and meaning, not merely as a source for historical facts. The argument matters because it reveals Tolkien's conviction. Myth and poetry are not childish lies. They are ways human beings carry truth when plain language is too thin. While his academic life grew, his family life grew too. Tolkien and Edith had 4 children: John, Michael, Christopher, and Priscilla. The household was not endlessly calm. Money was often tight. Tolkien could be absorbed and stubborn, lost in papers and projects. Edith could feel isolated by his academic world and by the strange burden of his reputation. Yet their home also contained playfulness. Tolkien created letters from Father Christmas for his children year after year, complete with drawings and invented incidents, as if he were building a private mythology to protect childhood from the harshness of the outside world. Then came one of the most famous beginnings in modern literature. One day, grading exam papers, Tolkien found himself writing a sentence on a blank page. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. He later said he did not know why he wrote it. It arrived like a gift. Yet gifts rarely arrive to empty hands. They arrive to hands that have been working for years. Tolkien's mind was full of languages, myths, and the memory of countryside comfort. A hobbit was a new vessel for old longings. That sentence grew into The Hobbit. He wrote it partly for his children, partly because the story began to pull him forward. It carried humor and warmth, but also a shadow. It carried the pleasure of home and the danger of leaving it. It carried in miniature themes that had shaped him since childhood: the value of simple life, the threat of greed, the unpredictability of courage. When The Hobbit was published in 1937, it became a success. Success is not always a pure blessing for a person like Tolkien. It creates expectations. It creates noise. It creates demands. Readers wanted more. Publishers wanted more. People began to look at him not as a teacher with a private imagination, but as a professional supplier of wonder. The publisher asked for a sequel. Tolkien began working on what would become The Lord of the Rings. He did not write it quickly. He did not write it with a simple plan. He wrestled with it for years, revising, reshaping, and deepening the story as if he were carving a path through a forest. His perfectionism was both strength and torment. He could not tolerate sloppy invention. He wanted the world to feel real, with history behind it, languages beneath it, and moral weight inside it. Then life slowed him again. Another war arrived. The Second World War began in 1939. Tolkien was older now, with children facing their own risks. He watched another generation head into darkness. He did not write his story as a coded allegory for this war, and he insisted he disliked allegory. Yet the atmosphere of the age inevitably seeped into his imagination. The sense of shadow spreading, the sense of ordinary people forced into courage, the sense of evil that is both seductive and brutal. As he wrote, the story expanded beyond a simple adventure. The ring became a symbol of power that corrupts by offering control. Not control in a cartoon villain sense, but control as temptation. The promise that you can force the world to be safe if you are willing to dominate it. Tolkien had watched empires and ideologies treat domination as necessity. He had watched the logic of necessity justify cruelty. In his story, the ring is terrifying precisely because it tempts good people with the chance to do good by force, and in doing so, to become the very thing they claim to oppose. That is Tolkien's uncomfortable truth. Evil often arrives as a shortcut. It offers you the chance to fix the world fast. It invites you to become the kind of person who no longer needs to ask permission from conscience. His other great realism is his love for ordinary virtue. The heroes are not perfect. They are tired. They are scared. They keep walking anyway. That is not sentiment. That is endurance. It is what courage looks like when you cannot rely on glory. During these years, he also built a circle of friendship that helped him survive the long grind of writing. The Inklings met, read, argued, and laughed, often in rooms thick with smoke and the sound of voices colliding. Tolkien could be irritable in debate, and he could be stubbornly precise, but he loved the fellowship. C.S. Lewis, in particular, became both ally and irritant. Lewis praised Tolkien's gifts, pushed him to finish, and believed in the value of his world. Tolkien, in return, influenced Lewis's imagination and helped shape the way Lewis understood myth and meaning. Their friendship was not always easy, but it was real, and it gave Tolkien something he had lost in the war, a circle that believed words matter. After years of writing and revision, The Lord of the Rings was published in 3 volumes in 1954 and 1955. The book gathered power steadily. Readers discovered a world that felt invented and true at the same time. Some were drawn to its moral seriousness. Some were drawn to its grief and beauty. Many were drawn to its depth, the feeling that every hill has a history, every name carries an echo. Then, as the decades turned, the popularity surged. Tolkien found himself famous in a way he had never sought. Fame brought letters, interviews, attention, misunderstanding. People tried to claim him as a political mascot. People tried to reduce his work to slogans. Tolkien resisted simplification. He was not writing propaganda. He was writing mythology. He believed myth has a special capacity to carry truth without being confined to one decade's headlines. A good story can speak across centuries because it speaks to human nature. He also believed something deeply Christian about imagination itself. Humans, he argued, are sub-creators. Made by a creator, we make secondary worlds that echo creation. When a story is true in the deep sense, it can produce a sudden kind of joy, a turn from despair toward hope that does not erase suffering but transforms it. Tolkien loved the idea that a tale can give consolation not by denying pain, but by revealing that pain does not get the last word. This vision is part of why his stories feel different from pure escapism. They do not deny pain, they insist pain is not the only final word. In 1959, Tolkien retired from his professorship at Oxford, though retirement did not mean rest. He continued writing and revising. He continued correspondence. He continued wrestling with the vast mythology behind The Lord of the Rings, the ancient tales and histories he had been building since the First World War. His struggle was not laziness, it was difficulty. He wanted myth with the layered complexity of real tradition, with variants, echoes, and depth, yet he also wanted coherence. He rewrote repeatedly, sometimes chasing perfection so hard that finishing felt almost impossible. His later years also held a quieter story, the long companionship of marriage aging into a different kind of bond. Tolkien and Edith had endured war, money strain, decades of work, and then the strange burden of fame. Edith did not always love the attention. Tolkien did not always notice how isolating his inner world could be for her. They could irritate each other. They could wound each other with small neglects, yet the bond remained. It had survived forced silence, war, and time. They moved for a time to Bournemouth, partly for health and comfort, and Tolkien's public world kept growing even as his private world began to narrow, the way it often does in old age. In 1971, Edith died. Tolkien was shattered. He had known grief since childhood, yet the loss of Edith was different. She had been his companion through everything that mattered. She had lived beside his obsessions. She had made room for his work. She had also been, in his imagination, the living source of his most tender myth. Life after her death felt quieter. Honors continued, letters continued, yet the center of home was gone. When he arranged their grave, he had a name carved beneath hers, Luthien. When Tolkien died on September 2, 1973, another name was carved beneath his, Beren. It is one of the most intimate gestures he ever made public. It says, without speeches, that the myth was never merely fiction to him. The myth was the language he used to tell the truth about love, beauty, and loss. If you want a single thread that runs through Tolkien's life, it might be this. He was always trying to protect something fragile. As a child, he tried to protect the memory of Sarehole's green world against the crush of the city. As a young man, he tried to protect love against time and authority. As a soldier, he tried to protect fellowship against death, even when death won. As a scholar, he tried to protect old language against forgetfulness. As a storyteller, he tried to protect moral reality against cynicism. That is why his fiction treats small things as sacred: a meal, a garden, a pipe, a song, a promise, a friend walking beside you. These are not sentimental decorations. They are the worldview of someone who learned early that the world can take what you assumed would stay. He did not deny darkness. He saw it clearly. He refused to worship it. He insisted courage can be quiet. He insisted goodness often looks like persistence. He insisted the highest victories may not be public at all, but interior, choosing mercy when you could choose domination, choosing loyalty when betrayal would be easier, choosing patience when bitterness would feel powerful. That is why his stories do not end with simple triumph. Even when evil is defeated, scars remain. Even when a king returns, the traveler carries wounds home. Even when the ring is destroyed, the cost is real. That realism is not pessimism. It is maturity. It is the moral vision of a man who knew the price of surviving. If Tolkien has given millions of readers comfort, it is not because he lied about pain. It is because he spoke of pain without letting pain be the only language. He gave people the Shire not to escape reality, but to remind them what reality is for. Home is not the place where nothing hurts. Home is the place that teaches you what is worth protecting. In the end, Tolkien's life is not only a story about writing famous books. It is a story about how a wounded century produced a man who built a myth large enough to hold grief, beauty, faith, and the stubborn hope that mercy matters. That is why when people open his books, they often feel something rare, not just entertainment, not just nostalgia, a sense that meaning still exists, and that meaning is worth the long road.
Tonight's story comes to an end here, but the past never truly goes silent. It lingers like a candle's last glow, whispering its warnings, its wonders, and its unanswered questions into the present. If this journey moved you, leave a like, subscribe to Ancient Luminaries, and tell me in the comments